In our last lesson, we talked about the Boston Massacre. Now, surprisingly, things settled down a bit after the massacre. Although the unthinkable had happened, British soldiers firing on British citizens, and although the city of Boston remembered the incident every year, nevertheless, life went on. Parliament rescinded many of the Townshend Acts, but it kept the issue of tea as a matter of principle. Now, the tea was primarily produced in India and China, and it was shipped exclusively by the British East India Company. It was taxed very heavily. So the colonists had two decisions. They could either buy British tea, but it was taxed and therefore more expensive, or they could smuggle in Dutch tea. The Dutch also brought tea from India and China. It wasn't quite as good, but it was cheaper, because it didn't have to pay the tax. Also, the Sons of Liberty argued that Dutch tea was more patriotic. So the Dutch tea consumption actually went quite a bit higher than British tea. What that resulted in was a lot of British tea was left in London, rotting in warehouses. In fact, by the mid-1770s, the British Tea Company was starting to go under, as most of its tea just stayed in London. Parliament reacted to this by creating a Tea Act of 1773. Their goal was to end Dutch smuggling. The easiest way to make the tea more appealing to the colonists was to lower the cost below what it cost for Dutch tea. So they removed most of the taxes, and that lowered the cost of British tea significantly. Meanwhile, the Dutch tea stayed about the same. It was no longer cheaper to buy smuggled tea. What ended up happening was everyone in the colonies lost. The people who were officially selling British tea now sold it much cheaper. They could hardly make any money. And the people who had been smuggling Dutch tea no longer had a product that was cheap. It was more expensive. So they were losing money. So the Sons of Liberty tried to create another boycott. What ended up happening here is they convinced several other colonies to stop buying British tea even though it was cheaper. In New York and Philadelphia, for example, Sons of Liberty intimidated the tea merchants and forced them to take their tea back to Britain. The ships were not even allowed to unload. In Charleston, the Sons of Liberty forced the resignation of the tea merchants, and the tea was unloaded and put on the docks where it rotted in the sun. But in Boston, a very famous thing happened. Governor Hutchinson owned part of the business of tea distribution, and when the ships came from Britain and landed in the Boston harbor, he demanded that the ships be unloaded. The colonists heard about this, and the night before they were to be unloaded, they raided those ships. They dressed up as Mohawk warriors, went onto the ships, busted open the tea chest, and dumped the tea into the Boston harbor. This is the famous Boston Tea Party. It's interesting that they dressed up as Mohawks. Whenever they dressed up as Native Americans, they were basically saying, we would rather be seen allied with the Native Americans than we would be seen as British citizens. That's very interesting. In total, about 342 tea chests were broken open and dumped into the harbor. Today, that would be valued at about $1.7 million. It was a significant amount of money. Similar tea dumpings happened later in New York. A large shipment of tea also arrived in Philadelphia later in 1773. It was aboard a ship called the Polly. Now, the captain of the Polly had 697 chests of tea, almost twice the amount of what was involved in the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty arrived and threatened the captain with tar and feathering. They said to him, quote, "What think you, Captain, of a halter around your neck and 10 gallons of liquid tar decanted on your pate, with the feathers of a dozen wild geese laid over that to enliven your appearance? Only think seriously of this, and fly to the place from whence you came. Fly without hesitation, without the formality of a protest. And above all, Captain Ayres, let us advise you to fly without the wild geese feathers." The captain took their meaning and immediately kept the tea on his ship and went back to Britain. So the Tea Act actually didn't accomplish what they wanted. They had hoped to drop the price of British tea so much that the colonists would buy it and the warehouses in London would be empty. But instead, ships kept coming back to London, still laden with their tea. The British East India Company was losing massive amounts of money. What's interesting here is that the colonists' response was not because tea was so expensive. In fact, tea had become the cheapest it had been in decades. Their response was because they couldn't make money on tea any longer. Instead, only the company in London was making money on tea. And also the company now had a monopoly that was such that even smuggling was no longer profitable. A monopoly was dangerous and might lead to other problems with London. Plus, this tea was essentially guaranteeing that a tax could be collected by Parliament. And any taxes that were paid would be used to hire governors in the colonies. Now, this is the most important part. Up to this point, governors had been paid with taxes collected by the colonies. Yes, the governors were appointed by the king and were loyal to the king, but who paid them? The colonies paid them. And because the colonies paid the governors, they had a certain amount of control over the governors. But with this new Tea Act, governors would be appointed by the king, and they would be paid by Parliament. That was dangerous. On Britain's side, the Boston Tea Party was shocking. It demanded a response because the colonists, they had been simply boycotting. They had been sending political letters. But this time, they actually destroyed property. And remember, according to John Locke, there were certain rights that every Englishman had: life, liberty, and property. And now it had been destroyed. Something had to be done.